Good evening. I'm going to start a minute early because some of you may want to get home this evening and catch part of the debate. I do. Anyway, my name is Maru Walliser, by the way. I'm co-chair of the lecture committee of the adult school. And I want to welcome you back for this second in our series on Islam. And also to remind you that next week there is no class. If you come, you'll have to take a midterm exam. So be warned. Some of you may have read that Barbra Streisand last week returned to give concerts in her hometown of Brooklyn. That's now 10. We have a similar occasion this evening, I'm happy to say. I have the pleasure to welcome home Professor Catherine Fleming, a Princeton native who was born in what is now the old hospital on Witherspoon Street, went to Princeton High School, and until she grew up and took off for other world sites and academic ventures, knew a lot of people around here. Probably still does. Since that time, she's become an academic achiever of note. Educated at Barnard, King's College London, the University of Chicago, and UC Berkeley, she specializes in the religious history of Greece and has authored several books on that topic, including, for our particular interest, The Muslim Bonaparte, Democracy and Orientalism in Ali Pasha's Greece. Professor Fleming is the Alexander S. Onassis. Is that bothering you? Okay. Thank you. I'll try to. Professor Fleming is the Alexander Onassis Professor of Hellenic Culture and Civilization in the Department of History at New York University. Can you hear me? Yeah. She is also Deputy Provost, working with the Provost and Deans to shape the university's academic programs. In addition, she is NYU's Vice Chancellor for Europe, working on the university's long-term strategic planning in Europe and supporting faculty and graduate research abroad. There, she is Permanent Professor Associate in history at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, where she had the misfortune to live for 4 years with her family. She's back in New York now, and she serves, in addition, as director of the Remark Institute at NYU, which supports emerging scholars, as well as scholars and writers working under political and economic distress. And they regularly host dissidents and others whose ability to work in their home countries is severely compromised. I think that's the way the Institute for Advanced Study got started in Princeton. Even with all that, she was willing to step up this evening and fill in for her husband, Professor Zvi Ben-Nur Benita, who was called to a conference in Canada. So we're very grateful. Her topic this evening is Islam in Europe, a historical perspective. Thank you, Katie, for being with us, and welcome home.
Okay, so first of all, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
I'm wearing one of those microphones that I've only seen on performers like Madonna and Lady Gaga. But unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to deliver quite what they deliver. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to be relatively brief because I know that there are competing events tonight. I myself don't plan to watch the competing events. But for those of you who would like to, I'll try and be quick. So Islam in Europe, what do these words conjure up for you? Chances are, and this may be biased because I did, as Maru just said, live in France for many years, but chances are they carry a whiff of the problematic, the anomalous, or the difficult. Muslims in Europe and Islam in Europe have been a particular focus of study over recent years. And this, in and of itself, underscores this whiff of the problematic, because of course we tend to put money into studying things that we regard as difficult. major studies, the best one, I think, undertaken by the Pew Research Center, have been funded to explore the future of the global Muslim population with a particular emphasis on Europe, assessing and addressing the problems attendant upon recent European demographic shifts. And now, if you do a quick Google search of the words Islam in Europe, you'll have confirmation of this sense of the problematic. The top hits are Wake Up Europe, Integrating Islam, In Europe, Many See Islam as Greatest Threat, Islam versus Europe, Islam's Place in Europe, and Europe and Islam Managing the Future. Now, notwithstanding the fact that it will not inspire confidence in my audience to learn that tonight's speaker has researched parts of her talk on Google, I would contend that such cursory results confirm that the relationship between these two monolithic concepts, Islam and Europe, is widely taken to be a difficult one. And just to think about this a little bit, we don't really talk about Christianity in Europe. We talk about European Christianity. We even talk about European Judaism. It has a name, Ashkenazic Judaism. But Islam, we don't really, or at least until very recently, talk about European Islam or about European Muslims. Instead, we have Muslims who happen to be in Europe, and we have Islam in Europe. But the two aren't really melded together. The reasons that this is so, I think, lie in history as much as they do in demographics. That's what I'm going to talk about tonight a bit. And sentiments about Islam in Europe, while extraordinarily prominent in modern European debates, indeed, I think, obsessively prominent, these are deeply rooted in history. And this is a history both of Islam in Europe, and also, we have to keep in mind, a history of Europe's own long-standing anxieties about all different types of outsiders. So the first big frame I'd like you to have in mind is this is not a new phenomenon that European Christianity, whatever that big thing is freaked out by the belief that it has some evil presence in its midst that must be addressed. At first glance, the difficulties that many have, especially that many Europeans have, in approaching this topic seem to stem exclusively from recent history, and specifically from a series of recent, very dramatic demographic shifts related to immigration. Anyone who spent time in Europe, say 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and then goes back today will immediately see what I mean. When I was a kid, I lived in Provence for a while, and when I went back there for the first time after almost 35 years away, it was a different place because so much of the population there is now Muslim. In 2007, approximately 7% of the European population was Muslim. Now this figure doesn't include Turkey, whose admission to the EU, as you no doubt know, has been blocked, simply put because Turkey is a Muslim country, nor Russia. In numerical terms, this translates to 50 million Muslims in Europe. 16 million of those live in what are now the EU member states. And of those 16 million, virtually all are immigrants or first or second generation Europeans. Because of dropping birth rates among the white European population, even now that immigration from Muslim countries is slowing, over the years, the share of the population in Europe that is made up of Muslims is going to continue to grow. The Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life projects that by 2030, there will be about 60 million Muslims in Europe, 9 or 10% of the total population. Half of those, 30 million, will be in the EU, or at least in the countries that today make up the EU. And it's interesting, I'll just say this as an aside, that the countries in the EU that today have the greatest percentage of their population made up of Muslims, Austria, Belgium, France, Switzerland, and the UK, are the ones that historically didn't really have a connection with Islam. Countries like Spain and Portugal, which have a very deep historical connection to Islam, have the smallest percentage of their population made up of Muslims. I suspect there's a connection, but I don't know what it is. Now, a very famous, and for this audience close to home, intervention in the discussion of these demographic trends was made by Bernard Lewis, the former Princeton professor and specialist on the Middle East, and Maru's former next-door neighbor, just to make this a hometown event. He used to live in the one house that is between Maru's house and my parents' house. But he's famous for reasons other than that as well. And one of the things that made him famous, or rather infamous, was an episode in 2004 in which he was interviewed by the Hamburg daily newspaper Die Welt. And as a kind of throwaway line in the course of the interview, he said, Europe is going to be Islamic by the end of the century, quote, at the very latest. And one of the people who heard this interview was one of the participants. This was when Brussels was drafting the EU constitution and also when they were considering another bid from Turkey to join the EU. And it is widely thought that more than any one other single factor, this comment of Lewis's scuttled Turkey's chances of joining the EU. Now, over the past 2 or 3 decades, Islam in Europe has emerged as the single most important question, and it is called this in Europe, that concerns the continent, its future, and above all, its integrity. In reality, this so-called question is in fact several questions involving issues of demographics, economics, culture, security, and above all, that mushy, fuzzy, ineffable thing called identity, a word I hate. It's noteworthy that in its modern guise, the question of Islam emerged with acuteness immediately after the unification of the continent in 1989, right after the fall of the Soviet bloc and the Iron Curtain, and alongside the creation of the EU. And I think this helps us see that above all, the question of Islam in Europe is actually about the very definition of Europe itself. And I won't go into a big sidetrack about European history or EU history, but after the collapse of the East Bloc and the rise of the EU to great prominence, there was tremendous anxiety, and there is ongoing anxiety amongst the individual member states. But what did it mean to be French if you were also European? And Islam became a very, very important component of those kinds of debates. Now, of course, there were Muslims in Europe long before the 1990s, but only in the past 2 decades have they emerged defined as a problem. And in this regard, though I hasten to say in many others not, the so-called question of Islam today resembles Europe's Jewish question, also called a question, widely considered to be the defining European question from the 1840s until the Holocaust of a century later. Indeed, some scholars argue very forcefully that the two questions are two sides of the same coin. A good deal of the anxiety surrounding the question of Muslims in Europe is connected to the idea, expressed with greater or lesser stridency by various right-leaning political parties, that Europe's true heritage, which is code for its Christian heritage, is in danger of being overcome by a growing tide of Muslims. I don't know why they're always a tide, but they're a tide. Not a flood, but a tide. In reality, though, the Muslim tide in Europe actually has, on the whole, been receding, at least if you look at things in a very broad historical perspective. Or at the very least, we can see in historical perspective that European Christians, or Christian Europe, has felt itself to be fighting this tide for over a millennium. So this recent 20-year-old burst of concern about Islam in Europe is based in discussions about Europe and European modern identity, to be sure. But as its second touchstone, it has a very long history of battles on Europe's southeastern and southwestern flanks against Islamic powers. And I'm not big on audiovisual, as you can see. I'm very proud of myself that I am managing to keep this lapel mic in place. But, so just imagine that you have a beautiful PowerPoint slide showing you the continent of Europe. And on the lower left of the beautiful slide, you have a peninsula sticking into the sea, and that is the Iberian Peninsula. That is the southwestern border of Europe, Spain and Portugal today. And way over on the other side, you have a more kind of ambiguously shaped peninsula sticking out into the sea. That is the Balkan Peninsula, and that is Europe's southeastern flank. And the action that I want to talk about historically now takes place on those two flanks. And I think that it's having the action on the two sides that defines, in many ways, what Europe is. So, Christians have been preoccupied for more than a millennium with Islam and the supposed threat that it presents. And indeed, I guess I want to suggest that part of the supposed problem of Islam in Europe is not that Islam feels so alien, as I experience it when I go on vacation in the south of France, but that historically, at least, it actually feels uncomfortably intimate and familiar. And again, alongside this, we have to remember the fact that Europe has a very long history of fears and xenophobias. Jews, witches, conversos, Albigensians, all of these have inspired waves of hostility. And to an extent, Europe's Muslims today are simply the new fill-ins in a very old space. So as bookends for the history we're talking about this evening, we have on the one hand the beginning of the so-called early modern period, the late 15th and 16th centuries, and on the other hand, the 1990s, about which I've just spoken briefly, and specifically the creation of the EU in 1993 under the Treaty of Maastricht. Historians, and I'm sure some of you out there are historians, I have to say I asked what my audience was going to be tonight, and I was told it was going to be intelligent non-specialists. And this is like the worst possible kind of audience, right? Like, stupid non-specialists is good. Stupid specialists are good too. Then you can engage them. But really, intelligent non-specialists is the most daunting category of all. So I'm sure I have some historians out there in that category. Historians, in any case, for those of you who aren't one, we use the term periodization to describe the dividing up of chunks of historical time into definable and isolatable periods. So, for example, it's because of this thing called periodization that we can talk about what is referred to by historians as the long 19th century. In the periodization of many historians, the 19th century didn't begin in 1800 and end in 1899. It rather began sometime in the late 1700s and ended with the First World War. So for me, for example, I'm a specialist on Greece. For me, the 19th century begins in 1774 and it ends in 1923, because for me, those are historically relevant dates. 1923, incidentally, being the year of the Treaty of Lausanne, under the terms of which all Muslims were forced to leave Greece and Bulgaria and relocate to Turkey. Historians think about different periods of time as grouping together around various processes and phenomena that give them meaning as a whole. And among the key events that give what historians call the early modern period, that's 1500 to 1700, that give this period meaning as a whole, are two major episodes in the history of the interface between this thing called Europe and Islam. Of course, the big kickoff for the early modern period are the voyages of Christopher Columbus, but they themselves are deeply intertwined with this history of Islam in Europe. So, I'm going to turn now to two. The final phase of the Reconquista of Spain, which culminated in 1492, and the Battle of Lepanto, which took place on October 7th, 1571. The 1571 action is down here on the lower right-hand corner of the slide. And the 1492 action is over here on the lower left-hand corner of the slide. It's just great, the equipment is working really well. It's really bad when it doesn't work. Okay, so first let's start with the Reconquista. From 711 to 1492, parts of Spain, or the Iberian Peninsula, were under Muslim rule. Now, that's a really complicated turn of phrase, under Muslim rule, because it suggests that a 700-year-long period of history was sort of an epiphenomenon. But it's also not entirely accurate to describe Spain as having been Muslim during that period. Even at the height of Muslim rule, which began to erode significantly very soon after the conquest in 711, and then rapidly declined from the mid-13th century on, even at its high point, Christians outnumbered Muslims. Now, some of you may have heard of the period of Muslim rule in Spain as the period of the convivencia, or convivencia, depending on whether you want to pretend that you're Castilian or not, which is held up as a sort of unprecedented moment of interreligious cohabitation. Have people heard of the convivencia in Spain? I mean, if I had it all to do again and didn't become a stockbroker, but instead persisted in being a historian, I would want to study this period of Iberian history. Maimonides, anyone heard of Maimonides? Okay, there you go. He is writing under the convivencia. The greatest works of medieval Jewish philosophy are produced in the Iberian Peninsula under Islamic rule. Yeah, how about that? Okay. So in any event, this period is held up as this kind of shining example of interreligious happiness. Now, we know better than to believe that this is what it was. And throughout the centuries of Muslim rule, there were constant efforts on the part of Christian Spanish kingdoms to push the Muslims out. And indeed, the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of the peninsula, is a centuries-long process, the climax of which, and end of which, came in 1492, under the famous Isabella and Ferdinand, who took the Emirate of Granada, the last remaining mainstay of Islamic power in Spain. But remember, one man's, or woman's, but it's really men, one man's liberation is another man's enslavement. For the Muslims who experienced it, and now remember it in history books, the Reconquista is instead al-istirdad, the recapturing. And it's well known that the Reconquista led to the expulsion or mandatory conversion of non-Christians. But far more attention has been given to the experience of Jews of the time than to that of Muslims. And some of you will have heard of the expulsion of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula under the Edict of Isabella and Ferdinand. Well, they weren't the only ones thrown out. The Muslims were thrown out too, and also were subject to the Inquisition. Over the preceding centuries, in the lead up to 1492, Muslims had been gradually forced southward down the peninsula in the wake of Christian reconquests of Spanish Muslim kingdoms in the south. The Muslim literature surrounding these expulsions and defeats reveals them to have been hugely traumatic for the Muslim populations they affected. In December of 1248, Sevilla fell to Ferdinand III of Castile, and the poet Arundi describes the events in terms that would apply just as well to the Muslim experience and view of the expulsions of 1492. And I'm going to read you the poem. And there's lots of literature like this from both Jewish and Muslim communities at the time. He writes, "Everything declines after reaching perfection. The tap of the white ablution font weeps in despair, like a passionate lover weeping at the departure of the beloved, over dwellings emptied of Islam, vacated, whose inhabitants now live in unbelief, where the mosques have become churches in which only bells and crosses are found. Oh, who will redress the humiliation of a people who were once powerful in their own land, a people whose condition, injustice, and tyrants have changed? Yesterday they were kings in their own homes, but today they are slaves in the land of the infidel. Were you to see them bewildered with no one to guide them, wearing the cloth of shame in its different shades, and were you to behold their weeping when they are sold into slavery, it would strike fear into your heart, and sorrow would seize you. Alas, many a maiden as fair as the sun when it rises, as though she were rubies and pearls, is led off to abomination by a barbarian, Christian, against her will, while her eye is in tears and her heart is stunned. The heart melts with sorrow at such sights. Now, as I say, this is very, very widespread genre, but what is striking is that the perspective in the poem is entirely that of a rightful owner, a native, someone who has been dispossessed of homeland and of property. And again, this is very striking also in the Jewish literature of the period, which both traditions are very famous for poems and stories about keys. Does this sound familiar to anyone? That people would leave with the key to their home from which they had been dispossessed. And they would keep the key in the hope that someday they would be able to go back to their home and use the key to go into it. And just as an aside, this trope has been picked up now in modern Palestinian literature about the houses that they departed from in 1948. This is a theme in the dispossession literature of the Mediterranean. So in any event, the perspective in the poem we see is that of someone who feels themselves to be entirely at home and is now dispossessed and in exile. So if there was at least some genuine convivencia, happy cohabiting, during the period of Islamic rule of Iberia, nevertheless, in the wake of the Reconquista came appalling treatment of Jews and Muslims at the hands of Christians. In November of 1491, the last sultan of the Muslim kingdom of Granada, King Boabdil, decided to surrender the last remaining Muslim stronghold in the peninsula to the Reyes Católicos, Isabella and Ferdinand. Boabdil's decision came after a decade of wars between the Christians and the remaining Muslim parts of Spain. And following a particularly successful campaign in the spring of 1491, Christian armies arrived that autumn at the gates of Granada. And you have to know a little bit about what a siege in the early modern period looks like. It's really, really scary. Well, no matter what side you're on, it's really scary. All of these walled cities are walled as fortifications against sieges. And what you are counting on as the person inside the walls is that the people besieging you, that's why it's called being besieged, that the people besieging you don't have weapons that can reach high enough to get over your walls. And you have the experience of it's very, very intimate. So you can get up on your walls and you can see the encampments of the people who are attacking you over a period of months, right? They hunker down there for months. And they are just out of the range of your weapons, and you hope that you're just out of the range of their weapons. And one of the most amazing accounts of this kind of siege is from actually the fall of the city of Constantinople in 1453, when you have people sitting up on the top of their wall watching the Ottomans out there preparing to lay siege to their city, and they see them doing some peculiar thing with a hot substance. They don't know what's going on. And what in fact is happening is that the first cannon used in Ottoman warfare is being built right before their eyes by a German, naturally. Don't everybody get all worked up. Okay? Is being built right before their horrified eyes, and they're kind of trying to figure out what it is, and then lo and behold, they learn what it is, and it's something that is able to blow holes in their walls. Okay, so here's King Boabdil, and he doesn't want to go through this. He knows how this is going to play out, And so he negotiates the surrender of the city of Granada. And he comes up with a long list of stipulations that would ensure the freedom of Muslim life in the city after a non-violent handover of power to the Christians. Quote, both great and small should be perfectly secure in their persons, families, and properties. Mosques and the religious endowments appertaining to Muslims should remain as they were in the times of Islam. No Christian should enter the house of the Muslim or insult him in any way. No muezzin, that's the guy who does the call to prayer, should be interrupted in the act of calling the people to prayer, and no Muslim should be molested, either in the performance of his daily devotions, or in the observance of his fast, or of any other religious ceremony. Oh well. The reality proved quite different. When Christian forces entered the city, the treaty's articles were altogether forgotten. Muslims, like Jews, were presented with the choice of conversion to Christianity or expulsion from Spain. And many of you may be familiar with the Decree of Alhambra, proclaimed by the Catholic monarchs on March 31st, 1492, because of the dramatic demographic shifts it brought to the Jewish world. But for the Muslims of Granada, too, tragedy came in the wake of the Christian takeover. And a centerpiece of it, and there's an amazing account of this, I'll read some of it to you, was an orgy of book burning in which all copies of the Quran and all other Arabic books, except for those with medical knowledge in them, were destroyed. The Archbishop of Toledo, who presided over the event, boasted that many thousands of books were destroyed. And here are the events as described in an account, an eyewitness account. He ordered that they bring out into the street all copies of the Quran, that is to say, of the most important book of their superstition, of their religion, and all the books of the Mohammedan impiety, of whatsoever author or kind they might be, more than 5,000 volumes with ornamental bindings, even some of gold and silver, and of admirable artistry. These caught the eye of some gathered round who asked for them as gifts, but he would give none to anybody, and all were burned together on a great bonfire, with the sole exception of certain works on medicine, a study to which people of the Arab race had always devoted themselves to great effect. And this last little thing on the medical treatises connects to another of the features of the period of convivencia. In addition to these great works of philosophical thought that were put out during the period, there was a tremendous production in the sciences and in medicine. Now, this is an instance of what is called libricide, or if it isn't called libricide, it should be called libricide. And as such, it stands alongside other unbelievable historical events, such as the destruction of the libraries of Alexandria in 47 CE upon the order of Julius Caesar, the organized burning of the Jewish Talmud across Europe in the late medieval and early modern periods, most famously in Italy under Pope Julius III, and of course, the massive burning of books organized by the Nazis on May 10, 1933 in Berlin, presided over by the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. An amazing episode in history. Now, famously, the German poet Heinrich Heine, who died in the middle of the 19th century, long before that last book burning, he had seen his own share of books being burned, and he declared prophetically, quote, "Where they have burned books, they will end in burning human beings." And indeed, so it was, not simply in Nazi Germany, but also after the Reconquista. And Jews and Muslims alike were among those who were burned. Now, while in southwestern Europe, Islam was engaged with most intimately over the course of the Reconquista, in the southeast, a similar centuries-long process of conflictual engagement was being played out. Though its final chapters didn't come until the 19th and 20th centuries, with the decline and final fall of the Ottoman Empire, its most intense moments roughly coincided with the timeline of the Reconquista, most famously in the Battle of Lepanto, which is 1571. So the thing I want to underscore here is that within the same century, you have these major battles being fought on the southeastern and southwestern European flanks against what is perceived as an encroaching Muslim world. Fought in the western Mediterranean in the Gulf of Corinth, off the western coast of what today is Greece, the Battle of Lepanto was a hugely decisive victory for the Holy League against the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had been gaining ground in southeastern Europe and across the Levant at a steady pace over the prior 2 centuries. The Holy League was a sort of consortium of all of the big Christian players of the day. Spain was huge in the consortium, also Naples, Sicily, the republics of Venice and Genoa, the Papal States, Tuscany and Savoy, and also the Knights of Malta all participated. In sheer material terms, the Ottomans should have won. They definitely had the upper hand. 251 ships to the League's 212 ships, more sailors and oarsmen, and more soldiers, although 10,000 of their oarsmen were Christian slaves, which probably contributed to their not moving as quickly as they might have. The outcome was the loss of almost all of the Ottoman ships. 137 Ottoman ships were captured and 50 of them were sunk. 20,000 Ottoman soldiers were killed or captured, and 10,000 Christian prisoners were freed, most of them from the galleys of the ships. And all of this happened in the time of a transatlantic flight. It was a 6-hour battle. Unbelievably bloody battle. Lepanto is historically important because it was the last major naval battle fought in the Mediterranean, and also because it is widely regarded, that term again, as having turned the tide in the ongoing battle between Europe and the Muslim world. And the battle has been immortalized in countless paintings, poems, and other works of art, most famously, of course, in G.K. Chesterton's poem, Lepanto, which I'm going to read to you. Don John pounding from the slaughter-painted poop, purpling all the ocean like a bloody pirate sloop, scarlet running over on the silvers and the golds, breaking of the hatches up and bursting of the holds, thronging of the thousands up that labor under sea, white for bliss and blind for sun and stunned for liberty. This is the 10,000 slaves coming up out of the ships. Vivat Hispania, Domino Gloria, Don John of Austria has set his people free. Cervantes on his galley sets the sword back in the sheath. Don John of Austria rides homeward with a wreath, and he sees across a weary land a straggling road in Spain, up which a lean and foolish knight forever rides in vain, and he smiles, but not as sultans smile, and settles back the blade. Don John of Austria rides home from the crusade. And we note here that this is depicted as, it wasn't a crusade, but it is depicted as having been a religious war. Spain was prominent at Lepanto, as in Chesterton's poem, and that is, of course, because Spain, as we've seen, had itself long been intimately familiar with the Muslim threat. Lepanto, for Spain, and on behalf of Europe as a whole, was a sort of coda to the Reconquista, a final expulsion of Muslims from the continent. And after Lepanto, until very recent decades, Europe did not feel itself to be existentially threatened by Islam. With the exception of the Balkans, which remained part of the Ottoman Empire until the modern period, Western Europe could rightly consider itself a Christian fortress and Islam an outsider. And to a large extent, that fortress mentality has persisted until today. Now we'll just talk a little bit about the contemporary period, and then we'll go home and watch the debate. Or at least you will. So, I mean, it's interesting because after the early modern period, after Lepanto, you see within about 100, 150 years, or over that period of time, an intensification within Europe of obsessions about Jews in Europe. And the dynamic is a very, very similar one. And if you look at the literature from the period talking about Muslims, the Christian obsession with Muslims, the language is very much transferable and echoed in the later discourse on Jews. Today, there are two basic categories of Muslim community in Europe. There are Muslim states, and there are immigrants. The only formally, officially Muslim states in continental Europe are Albania, Turkey, sort of, Cyprus, and Bosnia. And each of these four represents a different kind of problem for Europe. Bosnian Muslims were involved in major waves of violence throughout the early 1990s and were the victims of major crimes against humanity. Turkey, as I said earlier, was a candidate to become a member of the EU, but was ultimately rejected. And since then, it has gone its own way with an increasing geopolitical orientation towards its neighbors in the east and north. And this, in turn, is a new source of anxiety for Western Europe. Albania was and remains an isolated island within Europe. It's surrounded by the EU, but isn't going to get in itself anytime soon. And Cyprus is divided between an integrated Greek-speaking Christian south and an isolated Turkish-speaking Muslim north, a country that is recognized only by Turkey. Indeed, each of these cases represents a different type of rejection by and conflict with Islam on the part of Europe. It's very striking. Obviously, there are all sorts of reasons why these four different places have the sets of problems that they have, but it is very striking that they are also the four Muslim polities in Europe. The second category of Muslim community in Europe is made up of minority clusters dotted all over the continent, particularly in Western and Northern Europe, made up of immigrants. Now, in many cases, these migrants are former colonial subjects, for example, Pakistanis in England and North Africans in France, or they are worker migrants, the so-called Gastarbeiter, the Turkish guest workers in Germany, and in other cases, sorry, was my pronunciation execrable? Is that why you turned to one another and laughed? We'll stick with guest workers. It was already, when I made the throwaway line about Germany, I could just, and then it was, then I had to float the pronunciation. Okay. Or they're refugees, Iraqis in Scandinavia and Kurds in Germany. And these, again, are these groups, particularly this latter category, where there's no historical experience of Islam whatsoever in Scandinavia. And in other cases, patterns of migration show long-standing historical affinities between the migrant's country of origin and their country of destination. So for example, you have this really interesting phenomenon. There are more Moroccans living in Holland than there are in any other country in Europe. And at first this seems completely random, but the reason this is so is because for a long time, Holland and Morocco were allies against Spain during the course of this earlier history that I just described. And they had a very, very long-standing connection. They also had similar trade because they both had an Atlantic orientation. Now, these communities are growing in number, and their social and cultural impact on the countries in which they live triggers constant political debate. In most European contexts, the preoccupation is with integration. how does one make these immigrants part of the fabric of the countries in which they now live? The migrant communities themselves, of course, also generate their own intense questions concerning integration and engage in heated debate over how best to live as minorities in Christian countries, which is something that technically, in some legal readings of Islam, you are not meant to do. Part of being Muslim is living in a Muslim country. So this presents a major juridical and theological problem, the concept of being a minority. When the EU Constitution was drafted almost a decade ago, of the 105 members of the European Convention detailed to write it, not a single one had a shred of a non-European background. They represented the continent's political elite, and like that elite, they were white and Christian. The Constitution didn't go very far, as you may recall. The French and the Dutch rejected it in referendum votes, and Spain and Luxembourg, just to throw their weight around, even though it was a moot point because these two places had already nixed it, they voted in referendums and they approved it. Nobody else voted after that. Now, these rejections themselves had to do with an anxiety about Europeanness and its meaning. I alluded to this before. Why should individual nations, opponents argued, be subject to a pan-European constitution? Wouldn't that, in a way, be to cede national distinctness? But another dimension of the opposition had to do with religion, and with the fact that the lead up to the Constitution's drafting had been full of debates about whether Christianity would be invoked in it as a defining factor in European identity. And this was very prominent in the newspaper accounts in the lead up to the Constitution. Now, of course, this anxiety wasn't simply an anxiety about Islam. It was also, first and foremost, I think, an anxiety about Christianity, which has seen a precipitous drop in active membership over the past 3 decades in Europe, not in the United States. 1 in 8 French adults attend church, and among those 1 in 8, the average attendance is apparently once every 2 months. Now, I'm a historian, not a mathematician, but I think this implies that the high watermark of church attendance in France is something like 10% of the population attending church 15% of the time. Figures are even lower elsewhere, such as Britain and Scandinavia. And even in Italy, with the highest rates of church-goingness in the EU, only 23% of the population attends regularly, and again, that's defined as 3 or 4 times a year. In direct contrast to this, Islam has been growing in appeal, particularly amongst the children and grandchildren of immigrants. And this is something that's familiar to many immigrant contexts, that the parents, say the parents arrive in the 1980s or 1990s. They do everything in their power to blend in. They act hyper-secular. They don't flash their Muslimness around. And their kids feel disgruntled and feel tired of seeing their parents be embarrassed and ashamed of what they are. And the kids tend to be much more observant or externally observant than the parents. And in fact, there are many, many instances of sort of household debates or arguments over this, with the parents not wanting the kids to be ostentatiously religious. And the counterattack against this, against growing religiosity amongst this second generation, has taken the form both of an assertion of Christianity and also an assertion of secular values. And this is particularly prominent in France with laïcité. And this is something that very few of these Muslim immigrants can relate to at all. In fact, very few people who aren't French can relate to it. For centuries, then, Islam defined Europe and its limits and boundaries. Indeed, we could argue, and I guess I am arguing, that the concept of Europe, as we broadly understand it today, was born with Islamic expansion. Its eastern borders were defined by the fall of major parts of the Ottoman Empire, starting in the 7th century, a process that was completed only centuries later. In the West, the moment of birth for Europe came in 711, when Muslim forces from North Africa first invaded the Iberian Peninsula and began marching north. Charlemagne organized unified Christian forces, first to stop them, and then over time to push them back. As in the East, this process lasted for centuries, and in fact was only definitively completed in the 1620s with the final expulsion of the Moriscos from Spain. The Moriscos were the descendants of Muslims who had been Christian for generations, but even they were not considered Christian enough. Through this optic, we can see that Europe spent almost a millennium pushing back Muslims from both sides of the continent, the southeast and the southwest. It's no wonder then that images from the period remain potent to this day. Reconquest, crusade, expulsion, invasion. These concepts and terms still resonate, shape, and plague debates about Islam in Europe today. But in conclusion, we should observe that for their part, Europe's Muslims are finally starting to feel that in Europe, they are at home, or at least that they should feel at home. Just a few years ago, Tariq Ramadan boldly defined Europe as a meaningful space for Muslims. He said, "The European environment is a space of responsibility for Muslims. This is exactly the meaning of the notion space of testimony." The term in Arabic is dar al-shahada, the shahada being the assertion of faith. A notion that totally reverses perspectives. This is still Ramadan. Whereas Muslims have for years been wondering whether and how they would be accepted in Europe, Muslims have now attained an exacting responsibility to contribute wherever they are to promoting good and equity within and through human brotherhood. Muslims' outlook now must change from the reality of protection to that of an authentic contribution, is the end of the quote. If the long history of Islam's encounter with Europe is anything to go by, it may well be that Islam and Muslims will in fact accept Europe before Europe is fully able to accept them. And in consequence, both Islam and Europe will have been changed. Thank you very much. Questions if there are burning questions, but I'm also happy for you all to flee up the stairs and make it home within the next 8 minutes. Are there questions?
What extent are some of the radical events that we see sometimes in France and the reaction to the state having an impact both on the Muslim community and on the rest of the European community?
Well, certainly, events of that sort, the response, not uniformly, but in most European countries, is a reassertion of secular democratic principles. However, it takes a bizarre form, because usually part of the conversation, they don't simply say, look, you can't blow stuff up, you can't kill people, you can't terrorize people, you can't do that, you're not allowed to do that. In my view, they make the mistake of entering into a religious discussion about it, right? So they will say all of those things, which are indeed assertions of principles of liberal democracy, but then they will also say, we must have respect for all religions. We must understand also that in Islam, it's wrong to show graven images. They'll say all kinds of things in a sort of effort to have some kind of interreligious dialogue. And in my view, that is a mistake. It's better to just, this is a crime like any other crime, and as such, it is not to be tolerated. But you also have people deliberately provoking events of this sort by, publishing cartoons and that. Yes.
Say a few words about differences or similarities in the degree of character of integration of Muslims in Europe. Would you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is whether I could comment briefly in comparative terms on the degree of integration of Muslims in the United States and Muslims in Europe. So I rarely wax American, but there is something about all the stuff that I learned in social studies in 8th grade that is now regarded with contempt about the great melting pot. There is something in America, or in many places in America, about the fundamental assumption that most people are immigrants that simply does not exist in Europe. And I would say that because of that, integration of all sorts of peoples has followed a different and in many ways easier trajectory in the States than it has in Europe. Now, I hasten to say, I say that as a rich, white Episcopalian from Princeton, New Jersey, right? Like, hey, it feels really good, I think integration's going really well for me. Right, so, so you would very likely get a more heated or very different response from someone who isn't in my vantage point. But nevertheless, I do think that there is something about the randomness, I don't even think that it's specific policies that we have, of the way integration is perceived in the United States, where you're not integrating into something. The something that is American culture is viewed as a product of everybody's integration. Whereas in Europe, one of the things that's difficult about this conversation about integration is the assumption that there is something there that is Frenchness or Dutchness or Britishness, and that immigrants are supposed to become part of that thing. Yes?
I so like that you cited Tariq Ramadan, who so famously was not given a visa after supposedly, after he was supposed to be at Notre Dame for a while. He was at 92nd Street Y last year debating Chris Hitchens at the very end of his life about peacefulness. The audience was not terribly receptive to Ramadan, who was here last year. I won't pretend that I fully appreciated what you had said about him. I wonder if you take just one more moment to speak about your choice of him to conclude your remarks.
Well, the reason I choose him to conclude my remarks is because he is probably the closest thing there is to a spokesman for elite European Islam, emphasis on elite European Islam, who opines regularly and publicly about the idea of Europe as a space for Muslims.